Bret Devereaux, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto my podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, okay, first question, pretty simple. Who are you?
We just want to go like deep and sort of metaphysics on this stuff.
Yeah, you're no, like
Um,
you're a sack of water and like molecules and skin and
right,
all that.
right.
Yeah.
Um, I am I'm a historian. I have a PhD in ancient and military history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I teach history and somewhat unusually this fall Latin at North Carolina State University, where I'm a teaching assistant professor. I also write for I research publications, but also a blog for the public. I also write for foreign policy from time to time in other places as well. So there's a decent chance people have seen my writing online.
Why? So your blog is titled A Collection of Unmitigated Pedantry. Why is that? Why is that your title? Is it because your writing is just like unreasonably like pedantic and nitpicky to most people? Is that it?
So I came up with that title as a bit of a joke back when I expected that no one would read this thing. But yes, part of it was that a lot of my early stuff, and I still occasionally do this on the blog, was nitpicking historical and fantasy film and literature from a historian's perspective. And so the joke is that the unmitigated pedantry is my relentless sort of nitpicking. But it's also, of course, funny because the acronym is a coup. So it has it's the military history joke there.
Yes.
Right.
Just
The
like
coup
how there
conspiracy.
were like it was never made explicit, but just like how there were implicit fears that the Continental Army might stage a coup against
Indeed.
yeah. Okay, that was that I think that's
Solid transition.
yeah, that was not intentional, but I guess that's a yeah, a pretty solid transition to so you I'm gonna quote your blog post on this. The first really firm step in the establishment of the American civil military tradition comes in March of 1783. So could you tell the story of the Newburgh controversy and the address which laid the foundation for like many of the norms in the military that we now have?
Yeah. So the context that folks need to know for the Newburgh Conspiracy, um, the the historical moment is interesting. The Revolutionary War has been won, but it is not over. Um, right. And this is a product of long Atlantic distances, the slow process of negotiation. The negotiations to actually end the American Revolution also get bogged down because the victory at Yorktown comes in the context of the revolution becoming a general European war. So suddenly you're like, the Dutch and the Spanish need to get peace treaties too. And you're like, oh God. Anyway, the result is Washington is sitting with his army. The army is in being. It can't be dismissed yet. Uh, but the war is functionally done. And so people are thinking about the future, and the soldiers, particularly the officers, are thinking about how they're going to get paid.
Is it
They had been,
like there's that like one throwaway line in Hamilton where George Washington's like we're working with a third of like what are like how they're like constantly underfunded and just
yes.
yes. Yeah.
And the thing here is that the Continental Congress did not have the power to raise money. And the Congress under the Articles of Confederation won't have that power either. They were reliant on the states to do it, and the states were reluctant to give the Congress any money. And so this was a continuous problem. But the officers in the Continental Army had been promised European style pensions. If you were an officer in a European army in this period, it was fairly typical that you would receive some percentage of your salary in perpetuity after the conclusion of a war. They were promised those kinds of pensions, and you get the collision of a military concern, like the concern of the officers, I should say, rather than a military concern, that they would like to get their pensions, with politics happening back in the Congress. Because the debate in the Congress is what kind of government are we going to have and how is it going to be structured? And so you have a set of political leaders who want the Congress to have significantly more power, and they would like it to have the power to tax. And they see the officers concerned about their pensions. and as a lever to convince other members of the Congress to allow the Congress to have the power to tax.
They saw it as like a stepping stone for like,
Yeah,
yeah.
right. It was like, and there's an understanding, again, this is a conspiracy, so our sources don't always explain themselves, or not very truthfully. But there seems to be an understanding among some of these fellows. I don't have their names in front of me. I list them in the piece. Um, that if they can raise the temperature on the officer dissatisfaction, it will increase the pressure to get them the legislative solution that they want.
And like this was never stated outright because they wanted plausible deniability,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah. Um, and this is happening in the context of Washington is, for reasons, away from the army that is camped at Newburgh for a few weeks, and the temperature on this issue starts going up. And so you have officers who are agitating for something to happen. They're agitating for the army to make some sort of statement. And you're starting to get the implication that maybe what the army should do is march on the Congress and deliver its demands or threaten to do so. This isn't as inconceivable as people may think. Um, the Continental Army had had pay-related mutinies already. Um, actually, somewhat significantly during the Yorktown campaign, where so Cornwallis is shut up in Yorktown, and Washington has to march his army from New York, where it is, all the way down to Virginia. Um, the army has to pass through Philadelphia, and he has to spend a little more than a day dealing with a pay mutiny because the soldiers are like, we're not marching any further. Like the Congress is right here. We're not marching any further until you actually pay us. And Washington is like, guys, we need to be in Virginia like right now to win the war. So this has been a bubbling issue for a while. Washington returns to the camp in March. Um, and I think recognizes the peril, but also, and this is sort of the genius of George Washington, I think recognizes the need that the country has and the danger that this represents. Like if you're George Washington, yeah, you probably do think it's ridiculous that the Congress can't pay for the army. You have been complaining about this very problem for an age and a half, but he recognizes the danger. Now we get a sequence of events. It's unclear how much of this is coordinated. There is an initial anonymous letter which calls a meeting to take place in a couple of days. Washington comes back and he issues the very next morning general orders putting this anonymous letter on blast because anonymous letters can't call general meetings of the officers. That's something for the commander to do. And so this is a usurpation of authority. It's unsoldierly. So he puts that on blast, but then he calls his own meeting to take place the day later. And then I think in a clever bit of misdirection, and this is where you begin to wonder how much of this was coordinated. In a clever bit of misdirection, he includes in that he expects a full report of the proceedings. You need someone to take minutes, which implies he won't be there. Right? At a very sort of like, okay, I'm going to let you guys hash this out, and I'm not going to influence the results. Like that's the sort of implication. Um, Obviously, he's going to influence the results quite a lot. But so there's additional fomentation happening here. There are more anonymous letters. The officers gather for this meeting. And as the meeting is convened, they are surprised that George Washington shows up. Um, and um, he proceeds to he he shows up. He asks to speak. He's the commanding officer, so of course he gets to speak. He gives a short speech deploring the conspiracy, pointing out the direction that they are potentially taking the young country to, as he puts it, drown our new empire in blood. That like if you go this way, there will be no shutting this door, and it will be terrible.
And it might just like undermine the entire point of the revolution in the first
Right,
place.
right. You could throw away everything we've done here. And I think it's important. One can bring George Washington up for many criticisms, but I think it's important to recognize moments of exceptional character. Uh, if this guy wanted to walk in the room and be Julius Caesar, he absolutely could have,
He could have
right?
done like the Napoleon thing of like
Yeah,
consolidating more power.
absolutely. Absolutely. He could have made himself a dictator in this moment. But he doesn't. He doesn't. He has more character than that. He believes in the concept of having a republic. So he gives his speech deploring the idea of uh, raising arms against the Congress, but also even pressuring the Congress. He's like, you guys need to have faith that the Congress is going to do what they're going to do, but also using the threat of force is unacceptable, right? That's not an acceptable political activity. And then, quite famously, he has a letter from the Congress, which he pulls out to read. Um, and then, in a bit of high theater, um, he fumbles with the letter for a second and then produces a pair of reading glasses, which were new. Almost no one in the room would have seen him use them. Um, and he says something, I don't have the quote in front of me. He says something to the effect of you'll have to forgive me, for I have not only gone gray, but also blind in the service of my country. And it's this kind of high melodramatic moment. These guys, remember, have been serving with Washington for years.
Wait, so he was like implicitly guilt tripping them?
Yeah. Yeah. He's stressing his contribution that, like, look what I too have sacrificed, and I am asking you not to do this.
But he's not saying that outright. He's sort of like
No,
that's
no,
the
he's
implication.
it's the implication with the glasses. It is such a good moment of rhetoric. And we're told like men wept. Like guys emotionally break down at this moment. Like there is an emotional bond here. And he's like, look, I've been through what you've been through. We have all been through it together. And he's sort of summoning that moral authority in this moment with the eyeglasses. He reads the letter from the Congress. One gets the impression from our sources that nobody much remembers the letter from Congress, although it assured them that, like, we're going to figure out a way to pay you, we promise. The Congress does actually eventually pay these guys. The pensions are converted into lump sums. And they're initially given IOUs for the lump sums, and everybody thinks these will be worthless, but they do eventually get paid off, to the surprise of many people. So the Congress does actually do its bit slowly and late, as Congresses want. Um, but the conspiracy collapses, just instantly collapses. After he reads the letter, Washington leaves again, and the assembled officers come up with a joint statement deploring the anonymous letters, reproaching the idea that the army would turn on the Congress or pressure it in any sort of unseemly way. It is signed by every officer present, save one. And the one guy who doesn't immediately go onto it is like, I agree with the sentiments, but you all are giant hypocrites because you thought these letters were fantastic 10 minutes ago.
Yeah,
And
but
that was
like
his only
but
thing.
like they changed their tune and they changed their tune in a way where like I'm sure they also convinced themselves that they never believed it as well.
Yeah. Oh, for sure, right? You know, the capacity for human self-deception is enormous. What's significant about this moment, right, is that this is a fragile moment. And Washington, in this, as in so many things, is setting the model for what it will mean to be an American soldier and an American officer in the political state they will exist in. And that model won't acquire theoretical framing and sort of institutional buttressing really until after the American Civil War. The process begins a little before the American Civil War, and intensifies after it, um, where this principle will become a kind of doctrine of American officer training. And then finally, it'll get sort of its modern intellectual scaffolding in the 1940s with Huntington, with whom I have my differences.
Yeah,
Uh,
we'll talk about that
we're going to
later.
get to
At later.
that,
We'll get to that. We'll cross that bridge when we get there. Yeah.
right? But precedents and examples matter. And this is sort of the example that was being placed is look, The army is not a political entity. It is a tool of the political entity, which is the Congress. And then subsequently to be the Congress and the president once we get a constitution, move from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution, and that sort of mold. And that's a significant kind of foundation step. And where it's coming from, and here's where sort of my Roman history background is significant. What all of these guys are thinking with as examples is the late Roman Republic. And I don't want to oversimplify the collapse of the late Roman Republic, but rogue generals with armies loyal to them rather than the state were a huge contributing element to the collapse of the Republic into civil war and eventually into monarchy. And this is what a lot of these guys want to avoid. And so there is deep skepticism in that first generation of framers about standing armies, which also some of that dates back to the English Civil War and some of those controversies too. Deep skepticism about standing armies, about large armies, large peacetime armies, locked in military expenditures. The Constitution requires military budgets to be re-upped every couple of years. You can't just make them permanent and regular. For this reason, that they didn't want, potentially, they didn't want a permanent military institution at all. And all of this was a worry that it might undermine the republic, undermine the state. And I will say that as the history of many countries has rolled forward, the American civil military relationship has been remarkably successful. The United States has been devoid of things like military coups. But one just has to look at other countries abroad to see that this is not always the case. That it in fact takes quite a lot of work and quite a lot of care to keep a military civil relationship that stable. So the concern that the framers are expressing is not empty. They're not jumping at shadows. There is a real peril here. I mean, after all, the very next republic founded in the same mold as the American Republic will be the French Republic, which will then almost immediately be overthrown by a military dictator who seizes power, Napoleon, we've already mentioned. So, like, their fear that, like, hey, we're playing with fire here is very reasonable, but it permeates a lot of their decision making. You can see this with debates about the size and structure of the early American army, the role of state militias in that army, the reluctance to create permanent standing forces. And then there's always this countervailing push of military necessity to create those forces, and debates about the Navy, right? Washington okays building a Navy. Adams mostly begins building a Navy. And, if events had let him, Jefferson would have scrapped the Navy to the ground. But he keeps having trouble with pirates. It turns out it's handy to have a Navy when you have trouble with pirates. And so that back and forth is very much a part of this, and Washington is kind of setting the direction in both this moment at Newburgh, but of course also the first two terms of the presidency.
He's creating an important norm.
Mhm.
Like I think one thing that I think this is something that I like intellectually knew, but I don't think I fully like understood it on a visceral level until this year is like how much of the like American democracy and a lot of like America's like built-in structures, some of them are a product of laws, but some of them aren't. They're just a product of norms and just people doing stuff because the people before them also did stuff. And yeah, I think that there are two things that I want to bring up as well. So the first thing is one thing that I think you very reasonably mentioned is like the whole Newburgh controversy. Like it ended in a way where like everyone convinced themselves that they were never going to do a coup, yada yada yada. But like that, I think is just one example of how there were many, many, many different times throughout American history where if things had gone a slightly different way, then America would be in a much, much worse place than it is right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that usually when a better case scenario rather than the worst case scenario happened, it's because of one of two reasons. The first reason is that like individual people actually decided to make the right choice instead of the wrong choice. Like in your instance, George Washington actively decided to make the right choice instead of like taking a like doing the Napoleon thing and trying to turn himself into a dictator. Like there are so many times where like individual people could have acted within their self-interest, but they decided not to. And like though their individual decisions are the reason why America is better nowadays. And I think that the second reason why we got the better case scenario rather than the worst case scenario is honestly just a product of luck. Like there's so many like areas where like
Special providence.
yeah, like imagine if like FDR like actually died in the assassination attempt. Like imagine yeah, and like there's so many other times where like if Al Gore didn't concede the 2000 election, or like there's so many times where the reason why America survived its long-running experiment so far is either because individual people chose to make a very hard choice, or we just got lucky. So I think
Well,
go ahead.
I think it's worth noting that some of that blends together, and it blends together in character. That the Newburgh Conspiracy is one of the many moments which I think we might say ratifies the choice of Washington for that position because of his character. I think we overlook that uh, you know there's a tendency. We often talk about how much we want a smart person in charge, and you hear that a lot. And everybody has a different idea of what exactly that means. Washington was not the smartest person in that room. Um, Washington was not the greatest military talent ever to be. He was an okay general. Don't get me wrong. He had some remarkable virtues, but he had character. He was the sort of person who would put the Republican experiment before himself,
Yeah,
and that made him the right choice.
he had character, and that character was what allowed people that were within his community to actually be willing to follow him.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think, a lot of this, you know, why does the United States manage to stumble successfully through our problems? It's like, well, we've had the right people in the right place at the right time. It's Washington or Lincoln or FDR. It's like, yeah, but we picked those people.
Sometimes by narrow margins.
Yes, sometimes by narrow margins. And what made those people the right people in the right place at the right time was often not were they the smartest or cleverest or most talented, but did they have the moral character, the backbone to do the right thing, even when it was hard, even when it was unpopular, even when it was not personally advantageous, because it was the right thing.
Yeah, so I agree that like we do pick those people, but like I guess it is worth I do so this is just the last thing I'll say before moving on to the next topic. But I do think it's worth emphasizing that like a lot of the very narrow margins mean that like if we rolled a D20 and we got a 6 to just to use that metaphor, then it's possible that things would have gone in a much worse way. Just like how you could argue that the 2016 election was an example of us rolling a D20 and landing on a 6, where maybe if Hillary Clinton became president, then she would have taken those same American norms and continued to lead the country into a prosperous direction. But like I think some of Trump winning was just a mix, like a product of luck.
Right. And there is always a significant degree of randomness, of chance, of if not randomness, things you can't predict in history, right? This is Polybius talks about the role of 2K, of fortune, which he's a Greek, so he interprets 2K as a goddess. But she is the goddess who is chance and randomness. And it's like sometimes it's just chance.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's just random. Now, Polybius then goes out of his way to say, but the Romans winning was not due to chance. I can identify, but other things are. Sometimes it's just luck, and sometimes it is just luck. But I think you also, as you made a point of stressing, Some things are norms and some things are laws. Um, and that is true so far as it goes. I think as we're finding out, even the laws are really only norms. It's norms all the way down. Without the norms, the laws are writing on a piece of paper. With the norms, the laws have power. And this is sort of, oh, the norms are in the way, the norms slow me down, the norms are fussy, the norms are there for a reason.
Yeah, but then so like we're starting to realize how much of the American experiment was just a product of norms, and like how even the stuff that we thought was hard and fast laws were actually norms, and that if you move fast enough to break stuff, then like you can actually convince people to interpret the law in a way that's more favorable to you, even though literally everyone else would have interpreted it a different way. But that does make me wonder, like like maybe there are tons and tons of times where like part of the reason why like America never fell apart or America never imploded in ways that it could have is because there were sort of norms that people had taken to heart and like everyone did it, like literally everyone was doing it, and it created a sort of like a substructure where everyone just assumed that this was the way that you were supposed to do things in America, to the point where we started to take those norms for granted.
Yep.
Um, yeah.
What?
So
And remember, norms survive because they're enforced.
yeah,
Uh,
so may
right? Nixon breaks some norms, and then he is compelled by members of his own party to leave office in disgrace. The norms were enforced upon him. That is how they were maintained. And then, right, beginning in the 90s, that norm began to break as first one party and then the other showed that it was unwilling to enforce those norms on a president of their own party. Um, if it was politically disadvantageous. The thing to keep in mind is that, on the one hand, people look at the norm and they'll say this norm is in my way, it is inconvenient. On the other hand, if you take the norms away, all that remains is violence. Right? This is a sort of fundamental kind of like Hannah Arendt power and violence point, but it is true. The norms are a functioning of power, which is to say of non-violent compliance and cooperation. If you take the norms away, you drain the system of power. All that remains is violence. Uh, and you need a lot of violence. And historically speaking, no state has enough violence, though it will rip society apart trying. And so this effort to do without norms is doomed to failure. The question is what failure?
yeah. I guess then one question I have is like we obviously were very lucky that the American military, like for the most part, has never engaged in the types of military coups that used to be commonplace. And I think that we've sort of taken it for granted. But I want to drill down into so we covered a little bit of the why with regards to like one historical event, but I do want to talk a little bit more about what differentiates the American military from militaries beforehand. So like one thesis would be that the fact of a military being very professional causes it to like subordinate itself as a result of its professionalism. I think this is Samuel
This,
Huntington's thesis. Yeah. Do you
yeah,
want to
this
talk
is
about this? Yeah,
yes,
please. Yeah, explain this to the audience.
this is Huntington's argument. So Samuel P. Huntington, political scientist, writes a number of influential books. Although I feel the sort of necessary tagline that these are books that were influential but are often not accepted. Right, like if you walk into a political science discussion with Huntington's Clash of Civilizations in hand, you're going to be roughly treated. Influential but often argued against. In 1957, Huntington writes The Soldier and the State, which is a book fundamentally about the professionalism and the civil military relationship in the United States military. And Huntington is writing in an American context. And of course, it's 57. He's writing in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War.
Oh, 1957.
Yes. Yeah. Uh, and Huntington's argument uh, is that professionalization, which he defines both as there's a process of professionalization and there's an ideology of professionalism, which he equates. He argues that one causes the other. leads to his goal, which is, quote, objective civilian control. The military does what the civilian government tells it to. The military is fundamentally apolitical. It is a perfect and obedient tool of the civilian authorities. Um, and so, in Huntington's mind, American professionalism is what created this positive civil military relationship. There are some problems with this argument. And the most glaring one is an analytical problem. He has taken professionalism in the sense of the emergence of a profession with these sort of uh, specialized training, a corporate sense of identity, a collective professional ethos, that sense of professionalism. Professionalism in the way that dentists have professionalism.
Or lawyers have professionalism?
Yes. Yeah. Any profession. Professors have professionals. Um, and he has equated it to an ideology that the military ought to be subservient to the state and that objective civilian control is a thing to be desired and that soldiers ought to be apolitical. And the sleight of hand is that he calls them both professionalism, and so he pretends they're the same.
So like subordination is like a necessary byproduct of being professional, is how he views militaries.
That is how he views militaries. And he seems vaguely aware, more than vaguely aware, in addition to presenting a history of how that kind of professionalism and ideology developed in the United States, he's clearly aware that he has two, in 1957, very glaring problems. And those problems are Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, both of which had professional officer corps. And it's hard to look at either and be like, the civil military relationship worked great.
Yeah, like in Imperial Japan, soldiers were so professional they were willing to like commit suicide to kill their target.
But they were also willing to assassinate members of the cabinet, which they did repeatedly. Right? There's this problem. His argument about Japan is, oh, they were never really professional, and it's hard not to feel this layered over with a good bit of racism.
So wait, do you think Huntington is engaging in like a no true Scotsman when he says that?
Yes, absolutely. And his take on the Shermans is one of these things where you could make this argument in 1957. But his foundational facts that he is reasoning from have not survived the last 70 years of historical investigation.
They just
So,
didn't age well.
yeah. So his belief was that the Germans had achieved objective civilian control in 1870. That had persisted to 1919. It had come apart a little bit during the First World War, and then had been not reestablished during the interwar period, and then it finally had collapsed into this perverted form during World War II. And that vision, it was comprehensively dismantled by Isabel Hull with Absolute Destruction in 2006, where she points out that many of the pathologies that she doesn't have Huntington in her sights. She like destroys him as collateral damage. Um, but many of the pathologies that we associate with the post 1936 German military, the death camps, um, have roots all the way back to 1870. These problems already existed. The German military was resistant to civilian control in the 1880s. They were prone to atrocity in the 1880s. They tended towards extremes of violence in the 1880s. This was something baked into the institution. Even as, right, even Huntington would admit, the officer corps was very professional. It was the most professionalized in all of Europe, famously so, with the first general staff and the Kriegsacademy, the War College. These were the most professional officers, but they did not have Huntington's ethos of professionalism. The two need not go together. The other problem with Huntington's argument, it's worth noting, he's again a very 1950s understanding of the Wehrmacht's role in World War II. As people understand, right, you had the regular German army, which is the Wehrmacht, and then obviously you also had the SS.
This is during World War II?
During World War II.
Okay.
These are notionally separate institutions. They both have frontline combat formations. So if you're an American soldier, you could be fighting Wehrmacht troops in front of you or SS troops in front of you. They're politically different, uh, but they're both fighting you. After the war ended, like 1945, the war is over. It will not surprise you to know that a whole lot of officers in the Wehrmacht are very anxious to distance themselves from all of the war crimes. This is because the Allies are in the process of putting the war criminals in prison or on gallows. So if you're a German army general or colonel in the Wehrmacht, no one's going to believe you if you're in the SS. But if you're in the Wehrmacht, you'd be like, oh, all the war crime stuff, that was the SS. That wasn't us.
Would you have plausible deniability if you were to say that?
In 1957, no. No, you do not.
Okay.
Um, but this myth, we have a term for it. It's called the clean Wehrmacht. And is the idea that all of the horrible war crimes and atrocities were done by the SS, and that the regular German army mostly waged its wars according to the laws of armed conflict. In the 1950s, most of what Huntington has to work with are the testimonies of these German officers who are, pardon my language, covering their asses. Since then, the clean Wehrmacht myth has been utterly demolished. Regular units of the Wehrmacht were engaged in atrocities from the very beginning of the war. If these units weren't doing the atrocities themselves, they were providing cover and security for groups like the Einsatzgruppen, mobile death squads. These guys were very much aware of the programs of genocide that were being engaged in, and most of them supported them. Most of them were Nazis. That is, the officers. And so the idea that Huntington presents, where he has a line where he describes the professional officer corps of the German army as the evil was not with them, was not in them, right? And that's a very sort of clean Wehrmacht. He's imagining, oh, my wonderful professional German officers, they were fighting the war, yes, but they weren't like doing the war crimes. That was these other guys. And he's wrong. He's wrong. Those professional German officers were doing the war crimes.
Yeah, so you're trying to make the point that essentially it is incredibly possible for like a military to be extremely professional, extremely disciplined, extremely like willing to like obey the higher authorities, but still be like incredibly politicized to the point where they can launch coups against like their
Yes.
government. Yeah.
Or murder 8 million notional citizens of the state, right? It's important to remember when we talk about civil military failure, like the Holocaust is a form of civil military failure. If the military decides they're going to murder millions of citizens, something has gone wrong.
Okay, so like what is your explanation for why, like for the longest time, even though the American military was professional, it never like politicized itself in terms of like trying to commit coups or genocide or anything like that?
To be fair, it did do some external genocides.
Yeah,
They
okay.
didn't do internal genocides.
All right. It did yeah. So the American military has committed external genocides, but it has not committed internal
Internal
genocides.
genocide.
So like
I just want to make sure we're not
yeah,
giving the wrong impression.
we can fully condemn the American military for committing external genocide, but I do want to
Indian
understand.
wars here is what we're focused like, right, we're focusing on. But yeah, but no, you make a valid point here that the US military has not turned its guns against the government or the civilian population.
Yeah, they only
Um,
they only commit war crimes to people that are not American citizens.
yeah, look, the state and its militaries are tools to take violence in a society and push it outward. We should be very blunt about what they do.
All right. Yeah. So I'd love to take the military to town for that, but first let's talk about
First, we
why.
go to this.
Let's talk about why it hasn't turned its like guns inward.
Violence inward.
Yeah.
And right, and the answer is, of course, the US military has developed norms and a professional ethos that does include these ideas that the military should be apolitical, that officers should be apolitical, it should be a nonpartisan institution that follows the lawful directives of its civilian leaders, and that it swears allegiance not to a leader but to a constitution, which defines which directives are lawful. And that sort of complex is the ethos that the American Officer Corps has held to for a very long time. And you see Washington begin it, and it begins to get institutionalized in the 1800s, especially in the late 1800s, and then is sort of theorized in the 1900s. Um, I represent that actually as a kind of a bargain that we come to as a series of compromises. It's never a formal bargain, but an informal bargain. And basically, it is a bargain between civilian authorities, military leadership, and the civilian populace. And the bargain is essentially um, the military agrees not to insert itself into internal politics. Civilian authorities agree not to attempt to drag the military into internal politics. And then civilians, right, offer the military a place of elevated trust and prestige as a result.
Yeah, so it's like similar to the perceived neutrality of like the Federal Reserve, for example.
Yes, yes, in many ways, yes. And and people trust the Fed because of its neutrality. And like on some level, thank you for your service is a product of the bargain.
Yeah,
Without the bargain, people stop saying that at airports.
like we will respect you and salute you for your service if you're a veteran. And like that is our part of the bargain, and their part of the bargain is to not try to like commit military coups or anything.
Yes, yes. And the politicians' part of the bargain is to not remember those guys back in the Newburgh Conspiracy, the members of Congress who were trying to foment the conspiracy. The political leadership's part of the bargain is don't do that. Don't try to pull the military in. Don't try to make them political lose. Don't politicize the military in that way. That's the bargain, and that bargain was reinforced with norms over time and established. And you have sort of moments of tension and pressure where it comes to the fore very clearly. Truman sacking MacArthur is a famous example. MacArthur wanted to widen the war in Korea. Truman did not want this. Truman told MacArthur, like, nah, we're not doing that. And MacArthur went over Truman's head, both to Congress and to foreign governments. And Truman responds by famously firing MacArthur. And the last of these folks are very, very old. But like a couple decades ago, I used to joke on the regular, you could start an exciting fight in a retirement home by asking the assembled people, was Truman right to fire MacArthur? It was a very controversial decision at the time. But he was correct. MacArthur was breaching the bargain by
Yes.
going to Congress directly, by exceeding his role. He wasn't implementing policy. He was trying to make policy. He was breaching the bargain. Um, and
So
yeah,
so this is like one other example of how like in history there have been times where the civil military relationship almost fell apart and like the military almost became politicized in a way that was dangerous, but like the president would manage to stop it at the last minute.
right. Um, and I think, when we look at these moments, it's also important to recognize things can collapse suddenly and completely, but they can also erode over time. If MacArthur isn't fired, does the civil military relationship implode? Maybe not instantly, but it's weakened because the next generation of generals are going to have a model where, oh, if I don't like what the president says, I should go to Congress directly. I should go to the American people directly
But that
and tell
is like
them to
that's a
discipline the president.
like that's a norm that's unfortunate, but it is a norm where like if an entire generation of people goes to work to try to undo that norm, then the next generation of people might be like more fortunate in terms of the way that they perceive
Right. You can
political.
reestablish norms too. Yeah. But like you could see that it might not explode the civil military relationship, it might degrade it. And I think that's important because I think we're in a period now, I'd argue for at least 25 years, where this bargain has been not collapsing, but decaying.
So maybe like you know how whenever there's like a sudden shift in something, one saying that people say would be like it happened like the rise of something happened slowly and then all at once.
All at
Like
once. Yes.
one example that I like to give is I do think that the rise of Trumpism happened slowly and then all
And
at
then all at
once.
once.
Like I
Mhm.
think that over the past decade, I think that like the first 9 years of it, including Trump's own first term, like were an example of Trump like the rise of Trumpism happening slowly. And I don't think Trumpism happened all at once until his second inauguration.
And I
That's an
think you
example.
can,
Go ahead.
yeah, and I think you can project this even further back to the sort of some of the Tea Party roots of this kind of populist backlash that he has been riding, and the birth certificate birther conspiracy under Obama's term, right, is the sort of very beginnings of this thing that, as you say, it happens slowly and then it happens all at once, and a collapse of the civil military relationship can be the same thing. We actually see this, you see this very clearly in the Roman Republic, that you see in the late second century BC, the Roman civil military relationship, and particularly the role of commanders. You start to see figures, Scipio Aemilianus, Gaius Marius, early in his career, who are pushing the boundaries of what is acceptable for a general, how long a general can stay in command, what kind of connection and loyalty a general has with his soldiers. And then Sulla, 83, it breaks all at once.
Yeah. Okay, I think one distinction that I do want to make, that I think is important, is that, like, let's say that there's a negative shift in society, what happens slowly and then all at once. I think that, like, 100% of the time, if you want to undo that negative shift, it is always easier to undo it during the times where it is happening slowly rather than the times where it is happening all at once. Like, I think that Trumpism as a force, like, if we, like, in hindsight, if we had a much better idea of how to productively oppose Trump, it would have been much easier to oppose him before the second inauguration, because now things are happening all at once where it's orders of magnitude harder to oppose Trump. Whereas, like, obviously, if Trump lost the second inauguration, none of this would have happened, and there's a good chance that he would have just be in prison and we would have all, like, stopped caring about him by now.
Well, and the
Yeah.
other thing is, of course, yeah, it's easier to maintain norms than to rebuild them as well, right? When you think about what does it take to rebuild or to build a norm? And the answer is, well, you need broad public acceptance that the breaking of the norm was bad, and required sanction. And once you reach a point, it's hard to see without a catastrophe how you get there, right? How do you get people who right now think everything's going great to look at some of these things and say, actually, that was going the wrong way. And it's like the only thing that's going to change their mind is a catastrophe. But
Well,
you don't want a catastrophe. Catastrophes are bad.
and the sad part is there are some things where, like, if you ask people 10 years ago, they would have definitely considered them catastrophes. Like Jan 6th is something that would have been considered by as a catastrophe by like 99% of intelligentsia like 10 years ago. But like the frog has boiled so much more that that isn't even seen as a catastrophe anymore.
Right. Well, and you can see, right, it is not hard to imagine the different road. If Congress responds with impeachment and removal with January 6th, then we do remember it as a catastrophe. And the norms are probably reestablished.
Yeah, because like
But
at
they
that
don't. And
exactly.
so the political need is instead to normalize it. And so it was normalized. And so here we are. Uh, and as you say, the sort of the frog boiling. And I would say, to go back to the civil military relationship, because I do want to stress this. I don't want to give the impression that the problem here is all Trump. It is a lot Trump, but it is not all Trump. I think this is a frog that's been boiling since 2001, if not earlier. The You can see, for instance, efforts in the first, in the not the first, Bush 2, so W, right, efforts to shore up his political position by aligning himself more clearly with, like, because you have a situation where public trust in all institutions is going down except for the military, because the military is holding the bargain. And right, like, what is Bush landing on an aircraft carrier in a flight suit, though he's in the passenger seat, standing in front of mission accomplished banner, right? This is an effort to attach his political fortunes to that one high trust institution that remains, to bank for himself politically some of that trust the military has from the bargain. But that's a breach of the bargain. That's the thing you're not supposed to do. And I think you can see similar sort of erosions in the effort to get a hold of that prestige and trust the military has. I think you can see it as an aside, in John Kerry's presidential campaign. Obviously, he doesn't win, but he's a big deal about his military service. His acceptance speech was, "I'm John Kerry and I'm reporting for duty," which was an effort to sort of out militaristic Bush. It didn't work, but it signaled an almost bipartisan desire to kind of hug the military's prestige for partisan purposes.
Well, you could argue that. So I don't think this applies to Democratic voters or even like Democratic donors, but I think that this applies to Democratic politicians. Like, do you remember like in Kamala Harris's 2024 DNC like speech?
Lethality.
Yeah, like I like our like I will promise to like always support our troops because like American troops are like the most lethal fighting force in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And obviously what she was trying to do is avoid the charge that had crippled Kerry, which was, oh, well, Democrats are weak on foreign policy. She wanted to avoid weakness, but you can see the sort of the problem. This also mirrors itself in staffing choices. When the position of Secretary of Defense was created after the Second World War, Congress wanted this position, right, because they're creating a cabinet position to oversee the army. It's a reorganization, right? Because before that we had a Secretary of War. Congress wants to make sure this needs to be a civilian position, as the Secretary of War had always been, civilian position. And so they actually say, they're like, if you are an active serving officer or you have been recently, you can't be the Secretary of Defense unless Congress passes a law to enable it. And from the end of World War II to 2016, once, that happens once, Marshall. All the rest are civilians. Many of them had some minor military service because a lot of them are in the World War I or World War II generations. But mostly they're business leaders or politicians. They're people with experience organizing large organizations because the Department of Defense employs 2 million people. Um, from 2016 forward, we've now done that waiver process 3 times. For Mattis, for oh shoot, I'm forgetting his name. Biden's Secretary of Defense. Help me out.
I'm not I can't help you out. I don't remember.
Damn. I
That's
can't believe it's just like ridiculous
it's
brain
it's
fart.
it's not like the dumb question. It's not Blinken, it's someone else.
No,
Right.
it's not Blinken.
Yeah.
Austin. And then now we have to do it. I don't know if they've actually had the vote, but they need to for Hegseth. So this prohibition, this norm that the Secretary of Defense is not a military man, we've scrapped it in the last 10 years. We've had 4 of them, and 3 of them have been military men. Now the norm is that the Secretary of Defense is an officer. That's a dangerous change. Clemenceau wasn't saying nothing when he quipped that war is too serious a matter to be left to military men. Right? He's making an important point about the fundamental nature of political control of war, one that I will note listeners may also find in the theoretical works of Clausewitz. The political element in warfare is the supreme element, and it is handled not by generals, but by civilian political leaders. Classic sort of Clausewitzian trinity on nature of war. Everybody go read your Clausewitz. Please read theory, so on and so forth. Right, but like this is the frog boiling, that we now don't think it's at all strange that the Secretary of Defense is an active or recent military officer. And like, no, we used to go out of our way to avoid that because we thought it was dangerous, because it was dangerous. And in the case, obviously, of Pete Hegseth, he has no other qualifications, right? He has never run a large organization. He did not have a particularly distinguished military career either. He's not a deep military thinker. Right? The only sort of qualification is that he is and looks like a military man. And that's a very dangerous road when you start to say, only military men can make military policy, right? That weakens civilian control. Indeed, that is exactly the weakening of civilian control that afflicted the German army in the 1880s and 90s and 1900s. This conception that German officers had that the Reichstag, the German parliament, those civilians weren't competent to make decisions about military policy and so should not be allowed to. And the German army was heavily insulated from civilian decision making. And we are sort of slowly, without realizing it, beginning to build the same sort of insulation because first Trump and then Biden and then Trump again wanted a military man as Secretary of Defense because it makes them seem strong. It's politically useful, right? They're using the military for political purposes in that staffing decision. And so I think this is a perilous direction. And equally, you're seeing a little bit under Biden and now a lot under Trump, right? An effort to cloak political appointees in ways that would have been unacceptable before in sort of the tapestry of the military. Donald Trump went to a military base. He gives a speech. Traditionally, when presidents speak at military bases, they speak for all Americans. You're not supposed to give a partisan speech
You're supposed to be as formal and as formal as not a like nonpartisan as possible.
as possible.
You're not supposed to sound like an unhinged lunatic. Yeah.
And Trump he gave his campaign speech. He gave his stump speech. It was about, the Democrats are bad and we need to get the DEI out and so on and so forth. Hegseth talks like this too. He gave a speech there like this too. And that is traditionally the kind of speech that would be unacceptable for a president or a political appointee to give to the military. But in this case, not only was the speech given, the base was instructed beforehand to filter the audience to make sure that only soldiers who would be supportive of the speech were behind Trump in the crowd. So to create the appearance that the military supports his political agenda. Again, it's a breach of the bargain. And I think there are cautions here all around. Because I think people are, in many cases, do not realize the peril of undermining the bargain.
Yeah. Okay. So I think there's one thing that I do hope to pick up on that. So like when something negative happens slowly and then all at once, like I gave Trumpism as an example, maybe the decaying of American civil military norms is the sort of thing where it happens slowly and then all at once. Maybe we're fortunate in that even though we have warning signs, we're still in the part where things are happening slowly. Would you agree?
I mean, I think the thing is recoverable. The challenge, of course, is that the administration is going to be in office for 4 years. And it's clear that the administration does not particularly care for the civil military bargain. They view it as an obstruction when they don't view it as negative in its entirety. And so we've sort of signed up for 4 years of some pretty intense damage to this relationship.
Yeah.
So there's going to be things to fix. I think what I always feel is important to stress here. To sustain the norms, you must convince people that the norms are valuable and useful, that they're doing something, and that they're doing something for everyone involved, right? If this breaks down, if the military becomes a partisan institution, um, right, the politicians may feel like they can win something over by pulling the army into politics on your side. But let me tell you, once politics is about the guys who have guns, the guys who sit in offices wearing suits don't matter anymore.
Well, I'm sure that there are a lot of Americans who aren't that invested in politics who think that politics is always about the people who have the guns. They
Yes, and
maybe
they're wrong.
like
And they're
I know.
wrong. Norms matter.
Okay. Do you think you might be
But
over
for the guys that have the guns, breaching the bargain is also bad.
in the long run?
Would you rather be thanked for your service in the airport or treated like an occupying force? Look how the National Guard's reception in LA changed. Do you want that to be your experience everywhere? where people don't understand you as an apolitical agent of the collective public will, but understand you as the sustaining element of an unpopular authoritarian regime, understand you as the boot on their neck.
Yeah, like
You want to go home for Thanksgiving and feel ashamed. And it's like, no, no, nobody wants that. So the bargain is good for everyone.
okay, what about, I'm sure that there are some people, especially people on the left, who would say that the bargain has already broken and like America's military has already been like has always been fundamentally corrupt and broken.
Nothing is perfect in life. I feel like sometimes responding to these arguments, it's hard not to be a little bit patronizing, but I will try. Nothing is perfect in life, and the military has certainly never been a perfect institution. When I teach U.S. military history, you have to foreground the military was a segregated institution. It was a discriminatory institution. The military was engaged in some pretty terrible things.
Well, I think
Um,
ever since the second inauguration, I do think the military currently is like segregating with and discriminating against trans soldiers, but keep going.
Also, if you look at the pattern of Pete Hegseth's firings in the senior ranks of the military, also against women and soldiers of color.
That too, yes. But keep going.
It's not the first time the military has attempted to resegregate after a period of greater integration. That's happened twice. So I mean, folks should be aware just because things are moving in the wrong direction, they've moved in the wrong direction before. It is possible to stop them and get them moving in the right direction again. It can be done. You are not doomed. Decline is a choice.
Yeah, it takes that like it takes the effort and willpower of individual people who make the right choice over the cho like that that quote from Dumbledore about how like a lot of the time we are given a choice between what is right and what is easy. Um, I think that a lot of the time like, and I'm echoing something I mentioned before. Throughout history, there have been times in America where like good people stood up and did what was right instead of what was easy. And then what they did became the norm to the point where everyone started to take those choices for granted and assume that things were always like it.
Right. No, I think this is absolutely true. And look, um, you had take an example. African Americans served in the U.S. military from the Revolution onward. Uh, they were, as the prestige of the military rised, they were pushed out of service at various points. And so you have the sort of reintroduction of African American regiments during the American Civil War. And then after the American Civil War, particularly as Jim Crow locks down the relimiting of African American roles, right? The progress rolls backwards from Jim Crow to the point where I think in 1919, the U.S. Navy just bans all African American enlistments and has just no black soldiers until the 1930s. Right, it rolled back that far. Um, but then, of course, in World War II and after World War II, there was a push to integrate the military. That push wasn't accomplished overnight. The Navy was still sorting out some of its practices well into the 1970s. This was running parallel to the civil rights movement. And so these are things that they can move forward and they can move backwards. If you are going to make progress, you must begin by believing progress is possible. And I think there's a real danger in doomerism of declaring
Maybe,
all is lost.
do you don't think that there are
Then it
some
really will be.
you don't think that there are some left-wingers that have like extreme optimism like they're not doomers, they're very optimistic that this might be the end of the American empire and now we can finally get like countries that might lead the world without committing external genocide. Maybe they would say that.
Let's talk about Weimar Germany for a second. Um, in the politics of Weimar Germany, of course, everybody knows there were Nazis. There were also the Weimar German conservatives who were not like modern, like American conservatives. The conservatives of Weimar Germany they were monarchists, authoritarian monarchists. So you have the fascists, the Nazis, you have authoritarian monarchists, you have an itsy bitsy little liberal center, the SPD.
Well, I think like in the present day, I'm sure like Republic the
I
percentage
promise
of
I'm getting to a point.
all right, fine, keep going.
And then you had the communists. who had their connections to Moscow. In the 1930s, as Hitler is rising to power, what the communists told themselves is they said, no, this is good. It is good that the Nazi Party is coming forward. Um, because this is the contradictions inherent in capitalism. This will usher forward the revolution. It will create utopia. After the Nazis, it will be our turn. And the German communists focused most of their efforts not in destroying the Nazis, but in destroying the liberals. In part because that's what they were directed to do by Moscow, in part because the Soviets also believed in the ideology that communism was the natural endpoint of society, and so this is where everything would go. Was the end point of that a more just world? No, the end point of that was the Holocaust, because when you crippled the liberals, it left nothing but the conservative monarchists who sided with the Nazis and the Nazis. And the Nazis took over, murdered the communists, murdered the liberals, and did the Holocaust. So the folks who are like, oh, we just need to wait until the inevitable contradictions in the system collapse and produce the better world isn't going to produce itself, Chief. You've got to produce it.
So like we're not
Revolution will
gonna
not save you, but it might kill you.
we're not gonna let Trump continue to like we're not gonna be an accelerationist that's gonna let Trump continue to do his things because they're gonna lay bare the contradictions of late stage capitalism. Like,
Yeah, that's a terrible idea. It's a terrible, like, that is very literally how Hitler comes to power.
all right,
In- Now, if you want to say, hey, after we clean up this mess, there might be opportunities to repair and rebuild these institutions in a way that is more just, that forwards the public interest better, that, you know, does less damage here or overseas. Yes, sure, true, absolutely. It is a lot easier to do all of those things if you have an institution to reform than if you're building one from scratch. And it's way easier to do it if you haven't had a violent revolution.
yeah, I'm sure that America's foreign policy right now would have been much better if Kamala Harris won. She like jettisoned some of the neocons that she was campaigning with, and then she just followed like Obama's "don't do stupid shit" like doctrine, and then I think things would be fine on a foreign policy doctrine.
Look, I mean, and I think it's important. I mean, as someone who comments on security issues, foreign policy is hard. It is really easy to be pure and righteous if you are not making decisions. When you are actually making decisions, these things get complicated because you are dealing with complicated regions where often nobody is a saint. Uh, Everybody's doing awful stuff. And you have some hard-nosed strategic interests which are difficult and are problematic. And so even very well-meaning leaders are going to do things that in a perfect world you'd wish they didn't because the decisions are hard.
Or in a perfect world
Sometimes
would
that
be,
can be,
or in a perfect world they would be considered war crimes. Like, would you acknowledge that?
I mean, I think some of them are considered war crimes in this imperfect world we live in. Um, I'm not, there are things that should not be defended. Um, I mean, to pull out, right, like something like Abu Ghraib was wrong. Some of those soldiers were prosecuted.
Like the torture regime under Bush during the War on Terror.
Yeah, bad, shouldn't have happened. Not a fan. Um, I mean, likewise, the United States has supported, continues to support foreign regimes that engage in horrific acts. And in some cases, this is the devil you know over the devil you don't. In some cases, it is the lesser evil. In some cases, it is nasty strategic necessity. Um, or at least it was. American support, for instance, for Saudi Arabia has long been controversial, but if you want a stable global economy, they do produce a lot of oil. And that's not even a question of greed. That's a question because if you disrupt the global oil supply and global economic production declines massively, the end result is hundreds of millions of Africans starve and die. And if you don't want that to happen, you may be stuck with the House of Saud. Those are the tough decisions that the world gives leaders. And different people can cut those equities different ways and say, well, this was over the line and that wasn't. And then there are some things that I don't think can be defended. The torture, no. Um,
Do you think the Iraq War can be defended?
um, wow, we're just gonna get me super canceled today. That's fine. Um, so the complication of this view, please let me walk the whole thing out. The Iraq War was legal and foolish. We when we talk about just war theory, we talk jus ad bellum and jus in bello, a just cause for war and just practice in war. Um, the United States had a just cause for war in that Saddam Hussein's regime was not carrying out UN mandates and the agreements he had made at the end of the first Gulf War. So you have a valid excuse. Um, that said, having a valid excuse doesn't mean starting a war is smart. And so, on the one hand, I don't think the United States broke international law or the standards of interactions, the sort of broad norms of states by going to war with Iraq. We did make an error, right? It was a bad war we should not have declared. It was a mistake. It caused more problems, way more problems than it solved. It hurt a lot of people, in some cases unnecessarily, and it diverted resources from the war that functionally everybody agreed we probably did need to fight in Afghanistan. And so I think it is possible to have a war that is legal and foolish, which is about where I would put the Iraq War. Uh, and then there's the second question of right just conduct in the war, which my own assessment, U.S. conduct in Iraq mostly conformed to the laws of armed conflict, but there were some shocking deviations, Abu Ghraib being the one everyone knows.
So your argument is that the Iraq War, they were not like the US when they invaded Iraq, they were not breaking international law. They were just like foolishly getting millions of people killed for no reason. Is that your position?
I think for no reason is not the phrasing here that I would use because there were reasons. Uh, uh, a good book actually. Reading recommendation here. Joe Steeb's The Regime Change Consensus walks through the thinking beginning in the 90s that leads to this foolish decision. And one of the things that comes up is like Saddam Hussein was repeatedly flouting sanctions. When a no-fly zone was established over Iraq to keep him from murdering his own people, he regularly shot at our planes. Doing that once is a just cause for war. Like you have justified the response under international law. He had done quite a lot of things. He had also, though ironically, he doesn't have the weapons of mass destruction, he still refuses to comply with the inspection regime at various points. All of those things create the legal predicate. Does that make sense?
Yes.
You have the justification. That doesn't necessarily mean you should do it. It means you can do it.
Right.
Um, I have a car sitting outside. I own the car. It is legally my car. I could walk outside and set it on fire, I guess, and be within my rights to do so. That would be very dumb. That is the category that I think I would put the Iraq War into.
I think one thing that I find very interesting in this discussion is like this tension between critiquing and defending institutions at the same time. Like you're obviously not one of those left-wing accelerationists that would like they would point to like the Star Wars show of Andor and they say that like we're in that moment about how we need to see Trump do as much damage as possible as a way to like lay bare the contradictions of late-stage capitalism. You're not that type of person. You're more interested in improving institutions rather than trying to tear them down and create new ones. But I guess I want to know how much of a tension you see. Like, do you think that there is often like when it comes to people that are more institutionalist, do you think there is a reflexive tendency to downplay some of the more horrific things that those institutions have done because of how much they want those institutions to remain?
Oh, of course. right? That's a natural kind of cognitive bias and that we need to be aware of. And I you bring up the sort of Andor example, and the I watched the show too. Great show. Um, and I suppose the
Make sure to wait,
reason.
explain the things to the audience as if they haven't seen the show, like so that you can provide context and all that.
So, I
Yeah.
mean, I think the section that we're coming to is the bit with Gorman where right it although this happens in season one too, where some of the characters, particularly Luthen's character, essentially argues that it is not a bad thing if the Empire does an atrocity because it will inspire a response. I should note that a number of the other more sympathetic characters clearly disagree with him, including the title character, who does not agree that right, he is horrified by Luthen's thinking here. Um, and there's that tension, right? And the show kind of gets at that tension, which I think is really interesting. Um, so I am a scholar of the Roman Republic. And one of the things that you come away with almost necessarily as a scholar of the Roman Republic, and therefore being very, very aware of its collapse, is that while people often assume that the revolution with the capital T and the capital R will let them do all of the wonderful things that they want to do, revolutions are unpredictable things. They do not always make things better. They often make things worse, and they get a whole lot of people killed in the process. And so it is hard to look at those moments of convulsion and say, this is a better option so long as a peaceful political option exists. Now, if no peaceful political option exists, if, say, in 2 years, elections are suspended, a thing that doesn't exist in the Constitution, but if that's done, the calculus changes. But so long as there's an opportunity to solve the problem with votes and not bullets, um, that is going to be preferable to the convulsion of violence. I A second American Civil War would not look like the first one. Right? People would not be dressing up in blue and gray and marching in lines and firing muskets at each other. It would look like the Syrian Civil War at 10 times the scale.
And happening to the country that's supposed to be the leader of the free world.
Right. Which also, as a note, I guarantee you all of our neighbors and allies would be backing their own proxies in the insane, violent chaos that that would produce. Right? Because, like, if you're Canada, you're obviously going to begin, if the United States cracks up into a civil war, you're going to begin funding proxies on the Canadian border in an effort to make sure that this doesn't spill over into Canada. Um, and so, like, imagine the Syrian civil war, but a country 10 times bigger, where the states that are funding proxies are not like Iran and Turkey, but are much larger, more powerful countries like France and Germany, the UK, China, Canada, Mexico. Right? The damage, the death, the destruction would be extreme, would be horrifying. Anything we can do to not go down that road is worth doing. We should try every option.
All right.
And I think this is something to go back to the Andor example that the show is careful to show us. We see Mon Mothma in the Senate. We see the Gormans protesting in the streets. They exhaust every other option before fight. And you should, because fight is a terrible option. Now, in the end, it may come to fight. We live in a country where our founding document, the Declaration of Independence, enshrines the right of revolution in its opening paragraphs. Uh, but goodness, you don't want to do that if you don't have to.
All right, so then this is going to be one of my last questions. So you mentioned that we have like these cognitive biases where like there are some people that may be a little bit too trigger happy and trying to just like tear everything down even when think that's not the best solution. And then there are other people that might be more institutionalist. Maybe for the people that are institutionalists, do you have any advice for how they could like they could reconcile any cognitive dissonance they have in their heads about like simultaneously acknowledging the horrific injustices that those institutions have done while also doing everything they can to work within those institutions to make them better without just tearing them apart.
The cognitive dissonance you feel is essential. Without it, you can't improve the institutions. It's important, it hurts, it's painful. That is the ache of exercise. Absolutely, we should be teaching and talking about the times our institutions have failed and the things that they have done wrong, because that is how we get them to fail less. And this is, you see this right now. There is a program of sort of expunging references to America's failures and mistakes, right? There, in the military and other policy, an effort to whitewash American history by the administration, uh, because it's uncomfortable, because it's painful, because it's unpleasant. No, you must confront that unpleasantness. This is the only way the institutions get better. You have to live with that dissonance, because the pain of that dissonance is what will, when the moment comes and the choice between right and easy, what makes you choose right.
All right. Very final question. How do you rank the Star Trek shows that you've seen from favorite to least favorite?
Star Trek.
Yes. We're changing
Okay.
subjects now.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Um, okay. Uh, you're gonna get me so canceled. Why are you getting me so anyway? Um,
That's the point of an engaging podcast is to it's like
Clearly.
this is like you're doing mental exercise right now. This is a
Yeah.
muscle that you're
No, no, no.
yeah.
So best to worst, DS9, Next Generation. I'm gonna get people really upset. Lower Decks, Original Series, Strange New Worlds, um, Voyager, at least two blank spaces, Enterprise, at least two more blank spaces, Discovery, Picard.
I would love to comment on your ranking, but I think instead I'll just say Bret Devereaux, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
Thanks for having me and getting me super canceled.